Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage.
Hey guys, here I am back. It's a Sunday evening. Before I go into my next segment of my Terry Riley albums, I thought I'd go back to something that I started doing a while ago, and I didn't realize that so much time had passed since I did the last one. And that's something that I called iconic albums to me, personally. Looking through my past videos, it looks like I've only actually done 2 of these before. And I thought I had done many more than that. But I guess, I'm showing a lot of albums, maybe in other videos, that I'm not labeling as iconic necessarily, but I might point them out as being favorites. So to me, iconic, with very rare exception, has to have certain qualities to them for them to fall. There's lots of albums that I love that maybe aren't iconic necessarily, that specialized category. To me, even though I love the albums and the music on them. So I think with very, very rare exception, they have to be albums that not only are things that are my favorite albums that fall into that category, but things that probably made me listen to music in a different way, because they were albums that I picked up early in my development of appreciation for things outside of the mainstream. And because of the music on the album, maybe forced me to listen to or consider music outside of the more conventional ways that I had previously seen music. So one of the first ones I showed, and you can go back in the video. I'd love to talk about this one again, but maybe at some point. I love it so much. I bought the vinyl on a Christmas Eve one year. It was a particularly not a great time in my life, and even though I am constantly reminded of that time in the very early 80s, nonetheless, I'm always reminded of it when I play the album, but I love it so much. I have not only the vinyl, I have 2 different CD versions of it. Max Roach, Drums Unlimited, an album that was recorded in 1965 and 1966. And I just love it. The only bad thing with this album is I wish it had been recorded a lot better. This kind of music really needs the kind of clarity that is not that present on this. Of course, when you realize the years it was recorded, maybe you're not expecting the sound quality to be up there with something recorded in the last 20 or 30 years even. But it also, unfortunately, doesn't even have the clarity of the early, like Rudy Van Gelder productions, because unfortunately this is not a Rudy Van Gelder studio production. But I love this album. For a lot of people, maybe Max Roach is too mainstream. But this album, despite its less than stellar sound quality, only really has one kind of old jazz mainstream piece on there, and I mean like old-time jazz, in W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues. But everything else on the album are original tracks. There's only 6 tracks in total. One was written by the bass player Jamie Merritt, but that's the longest piece on the album. It's 12 minutes, 45 seconds, and the rest are written by Max Roach, including 3 short drum solo pieces that were just written for solo drums, between 3 minutes and 4.5 minutes. They're little mini, they're not abstract because there's actually little beats to them. And it's interesting to hear. They're not complicated or complex, but when you just hear a drummer playing completely solo like that in this little self-contained piece, it attracts your attention. Maybe the drums can be a solo instrument, who knows. But I have a much more detailed way back in my history of videos, I talk about this, and for people that like even more ECM type jazz with the free rhythms, this is the only place that I really recall hearing Max play in a couple of the longer tracks, more of a freestyle, not wild free jazz, but more like without a real structured rhythm, kind of like the way John Christensen or Jack DeJohnette plays. So a very progressive album. And I bought this. Max was still very much alive and working at the time I bought that. And then the second, I think it was the second and last Icon album I did, I'm not even going to talk about because it's Terry Riley's Lifespan, and I've spoken about that a lot even recently. So that was my other recent Icon. And this time around, I'm going to talk about two albums and instead of just one. Mainly because the first one is something that probably a lot of people are familiar with, and I've kind of made mention of a lot in the past, and that is Klaus Schulze's Time Wind album. And I'm sure I've shown it too. It's the original vinyl. Of course, I have like 3 different CD versions of this since. This was a real iconic album. It's my first Klaus Schulze album, and I couldn't have picked a better album because I still think this is his best one, along with his first album. And somehow I knew, I don't know from reading that, now you have to remember this, I bought this back in 1977 or possibly early 78. So there was no internet to go and do research. You couldn't hear the album before you bought it. I didn't know anybody who knew who Klaus Schulze was or any of the artists I was getting into. I had to pretty much do all blind buys. But I was always in the import section. And this came quite, a couple years at least before my discovery of any ECM or any jazz artists at all. And I was branching out from progressive rock. I was looking for weirder and weirder things in progressive rock. Primarily looking for instrumental things because I was losing interest in vocal things. And I was looking for music that went up to that next level. And in the late 70s, that stuff was already dying away because in England, punk had come along. And a lot of the bands that were doing very progressive albums started scaling back and making simpler music because the punk thing was happening and they didn't want to be irrelevant anymore. And also because, the radio stopped playing them. At least their newer albums. And then there was the whole disco thing in America, which happened too, which all of a sudden a lot of radio stations that could have potentially played maybe a little bit of progressive rock kind of thing on the side or at night split, and there were these commercial disco dance stations, and there was only a couple rock stations left in any individual market. They were still very much alive and everything, but their hands were forced, and they were at that point starting to play more new wave music that was coming along, shorter songs, less of the even established progressive rock bands. Forget about the ones that weren't established. So a lot of the bands I knew started making much more commercial albums, and I was looking to go beyond the stuff, the Tales from Topographic Oceans, the Relayers, the more advanced music even. And those bands started scaling back and writing simpler songs. So, I went and searched for, and I discovered some foreign prog bands that were very good, but, they weren't really at the next level. I wanted something that, when I first put on, I didn't get. And it took a lot of listening, and it was complex, and after you paid full attention to it, and you listened to it a bunch of times, like classical music, you began to understand, to hear themes, and I get this, that kind of thing. Wasn't finding it really in rock music. And without the internet and all these places that you can just go and not only hear it but discover that these people even exist, you're pretty much left to record stores. And so I went to the import section, which I had already been dolloping around and looking for various imports from the prog bands that had things that, like Steve Hillage, things that weren't necessarily released in the U.S. And I kept on seeing albums by Klaus Schulze. And this one doesn't state specifically that he plays all the instruments on there, but I guess from the information on the back, you can kind of maybe guess that's the case. And I think from other albums of his, where it may be more clearly stated, and I'm talking about his early albums, maybe there were certain albums where maybe more clearly stated that he played everything on them. Because I remember being fairly sure when I picked this up that he did play everything on the album, all the instruments. And I was interested in it for a couple of reasons. There was two very long compositions, two side-long compositions on there, each one almost 30 minutes. So right then that attracted my attention. Obviously knew it was instrumental, heavy synthesizer music, and turns out it's all synthesizer music. But at the time I couldn't be 100% sure because the information wasn't necessarily on the record itself. I made this correct assumption anyway, that it was totally solo, that it was Klaus in the studio doing it all himself. Now that's a concept that really intrigued me, and that's the thing that really made me pick it up. I liked that idea, and in none of the rock music I had was that really the case. I had, Paul McCartney's first solo album where he did play all the instruments was an exception, but that's such a different kind of music. People always, to this day, say that the original Tubular Bells was all Mike Oldfield, but it's not. There's a whole bunch of other musicians on Tubular Bells. So just because Michael wrote all the music and played the majority of instruments, there's female backing vocalists, flute players, the narrator, there's, I think, percussionists even on Tubular Bells, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But I know the concept was out there. And I'm not even sure if I was aware that, I may have heard that the jazz guitarist Les Paul also did a lot of overdubbing where he played everything himself, but I'm not sure if I was aware of that yet at this time. But I was kind of had the vibe, and maybe there was somebody even in the record store that told me that was a little familiar with Klaus Schulze. At the time, in the late 70s, I knew a couple guys that worked at this record store, and there was one guy in particular that was in charge of ordering all of the imports, and he knew what he was ordering. I mean, he was a music fan, so when he would order stuff, he knew what it was, what it sounded like, he knew the artist. So he might have said something to me, but not given me much information, made me pick it up. When I got that impression, well, the cover's great too, I got that impression that it was Schulze doing everything himself. And to this day, it's still my favorite type of album. I love the idea of not necessarily live solo, like a piano solo album, because anybody can do that. But the idea of going into a studio and one guy pretty much by himself in the studio, except for maybe an engineer or something, and he lays down a part, and then he goes back and he listens to it, and he lays down another part, and it's all him. There's nothing on there that wasn't considered or created by him. When you bring in guests, say you're writing something, you bring a saxophone player, and maybe you've gotten some written parts, but there's almost always the saxophone player is going to add something of his to it or improvise, and it's probably going to be something, even if it's great, but it's not something that the artist thought of himself. I like the idea of the artist being in charge of everything, that every sound that came out was from him, from his mind, from his creation, whatever. And I got home, I certainly wasn't disappointed in it. It sounds fantastic to this day. I think it's still one of his best sounding recordings. At that time, I believe, I only know now in retrospect, that Klaus had 8 or 9 albums out. I know his 10th album wasn't out yet. And so he may have had 8 or 9. And the record store probably had 5 or 6 or 7 of them. I don't think I had all of them, but close. And so it wasn't like picking through his discography would be now. So I got home, put it on, And at one point I had my bed situated so that at the head of my bed, I actually had I guess it was a chair, like a wooden chair, that I had I might have had my receiver perched on it, and on top of my receiver, the turntable, or maybe it was just the turntable, I don't recall now, but it was kind of right at my head, so I could lay in my bed and, just, I could look up and I could see the turntable right in front of me, and I could see how far along the record was. And it made it easier because to flip it over, all I'd have to do is reach out. So I remember putting it on and it being pretty intense and pretty much everything I expected. I don't think it was beyond my comprehension because I don't think it's musically difficult. It's not like you're listening to music in different scales or something that you can't comprehend, or like an orchestral music. But rather its musical direction was something that was new to me. Not that it was hard to hear the chord changes or anything, but it was the way that it created a world, and it took a half hour on each side to do so. And it just went along, and of course there's no vocals, and there's some building up and building down, but most of it is creating this world and existing in it for a half hour. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a lot of classical pieces that very much go from point A to point B, and through the course of their duration, there's a lot of ups and downs. I like the fact that this stayed in one place, kind of, with slight variations and a bit of dynamics going on, but just existing in this world, for a half hour on each side. And it was something that I wasn't even sure existed until I bought that album. And of course, there's no real sampling at that time. So even though Klaus is playing all the parts himself, there's no things that sound like drums. So there's no like digital or sampled drums. Everything is played on an electric keyboard and sounds like an electric keyboard, a synthesizer. There's a string ensemble and the big moog and a sequencer going on. But it's all kind of keyboard-oriented sounds, which is what I thought it was and what I was hoping it would be. And of course, it opened new doors to me because music that is that long, that's not either a completely written-out composition like classical music would be, or jamming like the other times I would hear, say, rock bands playing things that long would pretty much be when they were jamming. With a couple exceptions of side-long compositions that some prog rock bands would write that were basically just a bunch of individual pieces linked up. So this was really my introduction to a new world. And, I became a Klaus fan, obviously, from there, and bought a lot more. And I wouldn't say that was the thing that necessarily led me into ECM records or jazz, but it helped open my ears. And therefore, it's an iconic album because it's a personal favorite. It's a huge impression on me. Something I could still listen to this day. Kind of opened my ears and changed my way of perceiving what music could be. At that time, I wasn't. I was aware classical music existed, but I didn't put any weight in it yet. It was something maybe just beyond me, or something I just never thought I would jump into. I don't know why. But I was definitely ready to leave kind of the pop world behind. And so I've probably talked about Time Wind before. I've made some mention to it. So now, totally unrelated album I have for another icon. And when I do these from time to time, I might pick more than one album, depending on how much I have to talk about. And they're not going to be related because there's not always a correlation from one to the other. And a lot of times I don't remember what the correlation is. But here's another one. Now, a short time after getting into ECM records, I picked up this one, this Jack DeJohnette's Pictures album. A pretty early solo album of his on ECM. Fairly unique, certainly in his ECM discography. And I had heard Jack at this point on several albums. Some things I talked about recently, the Terje Repdal, Miroslav Vidas, Jack DeJohnette album, the Gateway album. I think this may have been after those two, my next Jack DeJohnette purchase. It was fairly early on. And so I had heard Jack with Gateway, specifically Gateway 2. That was the only one I had in the early days of my ECM collection. And I had first heard Jack playing on the 1978 Miroslav Vidas Terje Repdal album, which got me hooked onto his drum style, which I didn't initially understand because he wasn't playing this beat, this syncopated, kind of heavy, simple rhythm beat. It was much more abstract. So he became somebody for me to watch. And again, this is the late 70s, and when I saw this one, I thought interesting because I was already in love, as I mentioned before. This is after I had gotten into Klaus Schulze, but I was already in love with that idea of a musician playing all the parts himself. And I also like duet albums where there's just two guys doing all that, because with duets and with solo things, the albums aren't necessarily, and usually they're not set up to sound like a band. So even when the musicians use overdubbing to play multiple instruments, for the most part, the idea isn't necessarily to make it sound like one or two guys are a band, but rather they have some kind of musical concept maybe that for an individual piece or an album that causes them to want to put more instruments on there. But it's not like they're trying to necessarily, for the most part, fake you out and think, oh, this is the band. I hear drums and bass and guitars and keyboards, whatever. There's albums like that, but the ones that draw me in aren't the ones where they're trying to sound like a band. And yet they take full advantage of the studio. So here you have pictures recorded in February '76. I remember buying this I've told this story before, in wintertime, and at that time I used to always make, it might have even been 8-track tapes, believe it or not. I had an 8-track tape recorder. It might have been cassette, depending on what car I had. But I used to always make tape copies of albums that I loved or that were new and I thought were interesting enough and would probably get a lot of spins from me to play in my car. And I remember having on tape this particular album, the Pictures album, and playing it in the car. And I was waiting to meet a friend in a parking lot of a supermarket at one point, and freezing winter. It was either January or February. It was absolutely freezing, and I was listening to this album. And it's interesting because it was actually recorded in February. Of course, this was recorded in Oslo, so I don't know about winter in Oslo, if winter even takes place in February, but I'm guessing probably it was fairly cold when this was recorded in Oslo. So what's Pictures, if you are not aware of it, is a Jack DeJohnette half solo, half duo album. Like I said, I already had Gateway, which is a group with the late John Abercrombie and Jack DeJohnette and Dave Holland. And on this album, John Abercrombie makes an appearance. So it was kind of like Gateway without the bass player, but so it's kind of like duets with John Abercrombie and Jack DeJohnette on 3 of the tracks, and on 3 of the other tracks, it's just Jack solo. So it's a nice mixture. He does a very short album. It's all of about 37 minutes long, and this was another one that was because of the direction of it was a little let's say difficult for me to get into, but I had to understand the concept because it's not necessarily that the music was, well, the music is difficult in parts too, but it's also an unusual sound because there's tracks that are live tracks. So there's one solo drum track John Abercrombie doesn't play on, where Jack is just playing the drum kit completely solo, and it's one of the longer pieces too. It's almost 8 minutes long, picture number 2, and Jack's got the drums tuned melodically, and he's playing melodic phrases on the drums. and he's playing this rhythm, but he's also playing this melodic phrase along with the rhythm. And it's a live track, so it's a very interesting drum solo, kind of taking off from the Max Roach thing in a way. And it's quite different. Maybe a lot of people wouldn't like to hear a solo drum piece like that go on for 8 minutes. I'm fine with it. It's very much constructed. The drums are very deliberately tuned, and there's a little melody that I can still sing. I can actually sing the melody to this day. So it sticks with you. And the other two solo pieces by Jack feature overdubbing. The first one is actually the most... It's odd to start the album with the particular first piece that he chose, because it's an overdubbed piece, but it's probably one of the stranger sounding pieces on the album, in that Jack plays a drum kit on there, and he's got a couple sustained organ chords playing over this drum beat. It's kind of an odd time signature drum beat, but the organ chords are these very dissonant, very thick clusters of notes. So it's a very avant-garde kind of sounding couple chord changes that he's got on this piece, and they're just sustained while he plays this beat, this oddball rhythm over it. So it's a little dark sounding, and it's a little like, wow, gee, I don't know what to think about this. Of course, you listen to it enough and you get it. And it's only, let me see, it's under 5 minutes long, the first piece. But it starts off with the drums, and then these weird organ cluster pieces come in, and I think it might only be those two instruments. So it's not like it's trying to sound like a band, because he didn't overdub more than that. But it's an interesting, very interesting, unusual concept for a piece. The second piece I already talked about is a drum solo, and the last piece on the album is the third and final solo Jack piece, which is the easiest one to get into, because it's Jack essentially playing a very sparse little theme on piano. It's the only album track he plays piano on, and it's really pretty. That's one of the pieces that like anybody can get into. It's also one of my top 3 favorite Jack DeJohnette pieces ever. It's just this little sparse piano thing. He included this piece on his Rarum compilation, and it's mostly piano, a little piano theme, like I said, very sparse but very pretty. And then the piano kind of fades out, and in comes some percussion. There's some gongs that come in, and some cymbals, and some mallets playing the drum kit, like not rhythmically, but like a timpani kind of thing. It's a very interesting mood. And then toward the very end, the piano comes back in and starts stating the theme again. Really pretty little piece with this little slightly dark section in between there. The middle 3 pieces, picture 3, 4, and 5, are all duets with John Abercrombie. And 2 of them are live. The piece number 3 is just Jack kind of playing a rhythm, playing one of his it's a straightforward rhythm, but not a real syncopated rhythm. And John is just playing electric guitar along with it, 6-string electric guitar, and he's just playing a solo, and it's a live thing. So at first it's a little odd sounding, because in that kind of setting where drums playing a rhythm and you have a guitarist playing a solo over it, you kind of expect to hear either a bass line or a bass line and some guitar chords backing it up, to make it sound like a band, but they don't here. It's just the 2 of them playing like that live, and it's quite sparse. It's an interesting little piece. Again, a little 5-minute piece. Picture number 4 is the only time that they do some overdubbing with the combination of John Abercrombie and Jack playing together, and that's not much overdubbing. It's this, again, it's a weird little piece where John is playing some chords on the guitar. It's kind of avant-garde and dark, and Jack's playing drums, but he's not playing any rhythms. It's just all like tension, and over that is the second guitar part. of John kind of fading in some individual note playing, some lead playing, not soloing, but rather just a second guitar part that kind of helps create the atmosphere and enhances the chordal stuff that Abercrombie's playing for the first guitar part. Very interesting. And the only piece with John Abercrombie that's got overdubbing on it. But I really like that piece. And then the piece number 5, pictures number 5, is another live thing with John and Jack. Jack's playing drums. This time he's playing a rhythm on drums, mostly snare. And he's playing, it's almost a military beat. It's very interesting to hear. And John's playing acoustic 6-string guitar. And they play together, and again, Jack's got his drums tuned. And John is playing the same notes. There's times when they play the same notes, and John's rapidly picking out a note on the acoustic guitar that matches the note of the particular drum that Jack is playing. So there's 3 or 4 note phrases that Jack is kind of playing rolls on the drums, and John Abercrombie is picking back and forth the acoustic guitar very fast, playing the same note. So they're playing this little theme back and forth in kind of a non-rhythmic fashion. And then when they're done playing this, Jack will go on to play a rhythm, and John will play some chords. And at first, when I first thought this piece, I thought, wow, it'd be really great if they added a second acoustic guitar part on there to fill out the sound more. Because there's a lot of times when the acoustic guitar is just playing single notes, and it's just an acoustic guitar and the drum kit. And, but it took me a little while. I always liked the piece. It took me a little while to really appreciate it being live and them doing it and leaving it sparse. So instead of filling out the sound more with like a second guitar part playing some chords underneath a lot of what Abercrombie's playing, it really works because you hear the two of them in a way that I've rarely heard musicians play together. They really have to listen to each other because there's times when there's no rhythm going on at all. And they have to listen to each other to know when to switch notes. When they're playing that phrase, Jack's playing the note on the drums and John is matching that same tone, that same note on the guitar, it's not real clear when they're going to switch notes. So they have to watch and listen to each other so they can switch together, because it's not done in a rhythmic fashion. And then when they're done with that little phrase, then all of a sudden Jack starts playing a rhythm on guitar and they jump back into the rhythm. But they go back and forth like that quite a few times in the course of the piece. And you really hear these guys working together. This couldn't be done by musicians that didn't know each other well and hadn't played together a lot. And I really appreciate it. I'm sorry they never did anything like this again. And again, it's an album that, because of the sparseness of a lot of it, it took me a while to fully appreciate. Because I remember thinking, they should have just, initially maybe, they should just overdub more and more stuff, and, but there are tracks that have overdubbing. There's basically 3 tracks with overdubbing and 3 tracks without. But I've appreciated all of them and the way that they're done. And, they could have overdubbed more. It wouldn't have ruined the pieces, but through the sparseness of those live pieces in particular, and even in some cases the overdubbed ones, because the overdubbed ones aren't necessarily crowded with stuff either, you kind of get a new appreciation for the balance of silence and quiet, and it's not always just walls of sound coming at you all the time. So this is my iconic. This is as far as Jack solo albums go, this is probably my go-to, my first, one that if I could only have one, I'd probably, it's tough though. He's got quite a nice little collection of albums there, and he's got quite a few classic ones in there too. Okay, so once again, I went on about 8 hours longer than I meant to, and maybe I should have only shown one album. I don't know. But so that's my Icon albums, probably number 3, but I'm not even going to number it. And hope everybody's doing well. And I'll be back. Terry Riley number 3 is coming up, part 3. And there'll be a part 4 after that at some point too. Okay, everybody. Hoping you're having a great day. Take care.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.